2004's Van Helsing is one that's taken a lot of flack from a lot of people. Audiences didn't respond to it, the critics tore it to shreds, and when we reviewed it for the channel, my co-host didn't hold back.
Why does everyone in this movie look like they're in My Chemical Romance?
I understand why it didn't strike a chord with a lot of people, like it did me, and I'm not necessarily saying they're wrong for thinking it, but what failed so hilariously for everyone else worked spectacularly for me. And I'd like to get into why, in 6 basic points. In the classic Universal Monsters canon, Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman all coexisted in one larger Universal Monster universe. This is what one could call a proto-cinematic universe, the likes of which Marvel popularized and every other studio is trying to reproduce.
Half man, half sea creature, capsizing fishing vessels in the South China Sea.
There's gonna be carnage.
I could point these crap scenes out all day. We get at least 3 new ones a year. What was so special about the Universal Monster movies was that, in order to boost interest in multiple series at the same time, Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman appeared in movies together, with one major drawback. All 3 of these monsters barely interact with each other. That's right, despite all being in the same movies and all being on the poster, very, very rarely do Universal's big 3 either interact at all or are relevant at all to the story. In House of Frankenstein, the first with all 3, Dracula shows up, screws around for a bit, and then dies. Halfway through the movie. The second half of the movie concerns Frankenstein and Wolfman coming back and fighting at the end, just like they did a movie ago. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is the first real movie where each monster plays a role in the story. And yet, even still, Frankenstein is once again barely in his own movie, just like all 3 of the previous crossovers. They reactivate him at the end, he runs around blowing things up for 60 seconds, and then the movie ends. Fast forward to 2020. From the entirety of Universal's remakes, there have been exactly 0 movies with multiple monsters interacting on screen except Van Helsing. And not only do all of the monsters interact with each other, but they all serve a purpose to a story that intertwines the fates of all of these classic characters in a really effective way, which leads me to my next point.
What are you saying?
Why do you think I brought you here?
Just to sound them off, the movie has the likes of Dracula, Frankenstein, 3 separate versions of the Wolfman, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula's brides, and perhaps the deepest cut of them all, a version of the Mole Men acting as Dracula's evil minions. The only prominent monster missing is the Mummy, since that was already a much successful franchise at the time. Every single monster I've named serves a purpose for the story beyond, oh hey, they're in this one, look at that, isn't that cool, give us your money. The premise and plot concerns Dracula and his brides wanting to give birth to his stillborn vampire babies. To do this, he needs Dr. Frankenstein's monster since he's the only being who's been given life from death. The church Van Helsing works for opposes these plans, so Dracula manipulates werewolves to fend them off using a combination of hypnotism and straight-up torture. Even Mr. Hyde serves his purpose in the film in order to set up the blurred morality of the lead character. As Van Helsing puts it,
My life, my job is to vanquish evil. I can sense evil. This thing, man, whatever it is, evil may have created it, may have left its mark on it, but evil does not rule it, so I cannot kill it.
what started out as a normal introductory action scene with some, for the time, impressive CGI, ends with Van Helsing being forced to kill Mr. Hyde in a back and forth, and right before he dies, he reverts back into Dr. Jekyll. This explains his status as wanted a la the beginning of the scene, as the world views him as a straight-up murderer.
Van Helsing!
It's a sequence that sets the precedent for what this character is going to have to go through and endure when the brother of his love interest turns into a werewolf. Van Helsing is a movie that explores themes of moral good versus moral evil, in a context where pure evil, in the form of Dracula, is very real. The main character has devoted his entire life to vanquishing evil, but when Anna tries to kill Frankenstein's monster, he stops her, explaining that evil does not rule it. Contrast this scene with multiple scenes earlier in the film where Anna's brother turns into a werewolf and tries to kill her. When Van Helsing tries to kill it, she stops him.
He's a werewolf. He's gonna kill people.
He can't help it. It's not his fault.
I know, but he'll do it anyway.
Thus lies the real conflict for him. He knows that although her brother turns back into an innocent human being most of the time, when he does turn, he's quote-unquote ruled by evil, just like Dr. Jekyll was earlier in the film. Conversely, Frankenstein is created with the influence of Dracula onto Dr. Frankenstein for an incredibly evil purpose, but Frankenstein himself is morally good, which leads me into my next point. Now to me, I'm like most people. Boris Karloff is the definitive top-of-the-line best portrayal of Frankenstein. And I don't know if that'll ever be topped. But even Karloff's biggest fans have to admit that that version of Frankenstein was nothing like the book. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was articulate, dignified, and only acted with malice when malice was done unto him. And all he lacked in the book were proper discipline and love. Discipline being the reason he looked up to Dr. Frankenstein as a mentor, and love being the reason he wanted a bride. The interpretation of Frankenstein in Van Helsing is so close to this it's crazy, except with the added premise that Dracula only influenced Dr. Frankenstein to finish his work in order to use him for his machines. The very first thing Frankenstein wakes up to is his father literally being eaten alive. Frankenstein throws Dracula into a fireplace, takes his father's body, and runs to the windmill, where the village burns it down in a nod to the classic movie. Notice, when Frankenstein reaches the top after witnessing his only real family murdered right before him as his first ever introduction to the world, running rampantly from both Dracula and his brides and the entire village trying to burn him alive, his reaction isn't one of hate or pettiness. It's... a desperate cry of confusion spawned from a traumatic origin nobody wants to live through, monster or man. When Van Helsing and Anna find him in the ruins of the windmill, this happens.
What do you want?
To exist.
This is a being who's been created from the twisted influence of Dracula for the sole purpose of bringing his children to life. Frankenstein's entire reason for existing is to spread evil into a world that's already tried to kill him as soon as he was born.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil!
Frankenstein isn't interested in petty things like vengeance or retaliation. All he wants is what Dr. Frankenstein wanted him to do in the first place before the Count murdered him. Live his own life, however he chose. After helping Van Helsing to stop Dracula, you'd think he'd found a new purpose in life, helping Van Helsing fight other sources of evil in the world. But what does he do? In an astounding parallel to the book's version of Frankenstein, who left on a raft to die, this interpretation has undergone an arc, and after making actual human connections, leaves on a raft to live. He doesn't know what life he's going to live, but he knows his father would be proud of him, whatever path he chooses for himself. The action is awesome. Everything from to is beyond satisfying. A lot of the reason it's so satisfying in this context is because of the very specifically crafted tone of the movie. On my personal channel, I've uploaded a compilation video every time the Universal monsters fight each other. This video is about 6 minutes long. The last 3 are from Van Helsing. The first 3 span Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. 3 minutes over 4 movies. Now, I'm not making the point of just because they battle means it's good. Not at all. But as soon as Frankenstein met the Wolfman and this was the poster, this series stopped being in the horror genre. And because of the lack of action, they weren't in the action genre either. In fact, I would argue, except for this being a comedy, none of these movies are really a genre. They feel like corporate collections of their most bankable characters lazily thrown into the same movies since no executive thinks that just any one of them could sell a movie anymore. It feels desperate. Contrast this with Van Helsing. Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, from a few years prior, were box office successes, so this wasn't a landscape where these monsters couldn't sell their own movie. This choice to monster mash them together was with intent. Stephen Sommers, while not always hitting it out of the park, is a huge fan of the classic Universal monster movies and decided to take these characters and place them in a new setting. One where the movie knew what it wanted to be. Van Helsing is certainly more in line with his other movies. And it leans into the campiness of the classics. Even the classic Draculas and Frankensteins from Universal had a strong level of camp to them, but sometimes veered too far in goofiness to be taken seriously. Van Helsing takes these characters completely seriously, but it's the non-monster characters like Van Helsing himself in the movie that add a level of comedy and levity, not with necessarily the jokes they make, but how they act around them. On occasion, Dracula has a good quip.
I would kill myself before helping in such a task.
Feel free, I don't actually need you anymore, Victor.
But for the most part, Dracula and especially his Thanos-sized werewolves are a menacing presence on screen. You'd figure with a huge blockbuster vehicle for Hugh Jackman, with massive marketability and brand recognition of the cavalcade of monsters included, big and small, that of course the main villain who's the driving force behind the story and who's been played so charismatically, bouncing off the other actors on set, that surely a presence as strong and engaging as this one would be carried over for a sequel. It is absolutely kick-ass that the creative team behind this movie opted to flat-out vanquish Dracula definitively by the end of the movie. Having been the entire driving force behind the conflicts of this movie on every scale, there's a certain thematic appropriateness to him being completely vanquished. If he were allowed to live or escape at the end, something every other Universal remake of Dracula has done, then Van Helsing's ultimate purpose isn't fulfilled. That would be something we'd all have to sit around and wait until a sequel gets greenlit to take care of. Universal had the balls to kill off arguably their #1 bankable monster in their first Van Helsing movie, and the movie greatly benefits from it. This allows the ending to focus on Van Helsing's loss of his love interest and the departure of Frankenstein to live the life he set out to. Sequel baiting with dialogue like, "Looks like we'll have to hunt down where Dracula went with the help of Prodigium's Frankenstein brain and Wonder Woman's emails in Batman vs. Superman," would have completely flown into the face of the thematic resonance of the story and what it did with the characters. All 3 of his brides were killed too. Here are their deaths. They're dead. Completely demolished. The equivalent of this would be if Russell Crowe tore the mummy's head off and then set everything in Prodigium on fire. No studio would do anything like this today with a villain as marketable as Count Dracula, especially not the studio that made him popular in movies in the first place, Nosferatu notwithstanding. Every story thread in Van Helsing is tied up nicely, and while I'm sad we'll never get to see more from this world, I'm content knowing they'll never make any sequels. I'm satisfied with the movie that they poured their time and energy into making, and that wouldn't be the case if the ending weren't as strong. And that sci-fi show with the same name fucking sucks.